Hello, welcome to another edition of World Politics. This is the second lecture that focuses on realism, one of the major theories of international politics. Now, last time we talked a little bit about theory, and we noted that theories start with a set of simplifying assumptions about the world. And then we ask what what are we interested in explaining? We call that the dependent variable. So a variable is obviously something that varies, changes. It can be measured. So for instance, the amount of time I spend exercising goes up during the summer, and then it goes back down once fall semester begins. So that is something that varies. We could then develop certain hypotheses that try to explain why I exercise more in summer than I do in fall. And when we do that, we have to then resort to theory to posit some independent variables. So we would have a theory about, why people's exercise routines vary. And that would offer us some variety of independent variables to choose from as possible explanations for changes in exercise routines. Independent variable is the thing that explains the variation of the dependent variable. So if you have two variables A and B, if changes in A lead to changes in B, let's say if A goes up, B goes up, then you would say that, assuming that there's a theory that allows one to demonstrate causality, we would say that the independent variable accounts for changes in the dependent variable. Now, in realism, then we have to go back to our starting assumptions and ask, what kind of independent variables does realism posit? Well, in fact, what's interesting about realism is that a number of the key concepts do not vary over time, at least not over a time of the last several hundred years. So since what's called the Treaty of Westphalia, that helped to establish the concept of sovereignty and sovereign independent states, the type of actors hasn't varied, right? States under realism are the most important actors. That doesn't change. The motivations of states, depending on if you're a defensive realist, you say security. If you're an offensive realist, you say power. But the crucial thing is that from one state to another, whether it's security or power, the motivation still remains the same. It doesn't vary from one country to another. And the structure of the international system, anarchy, doesn't change. We haven't had the introduction of a central authority in world politics. So those are actually key assumptions. They kind of set the parameters, the scope conditions for realist theory, but they don't actually vary. So therefore, they don't explain change. What they can explain is the sameness of international politics, why international politics produces similar kinds of outcomes over time. In realist view, why states always arm themselves, or why cooperation fails so frequently. However, we do know that things do vary and change in world politics, and so how does realism help us account for change? Well, there is a key concept that accounts for much of the explanatory power in realism, and that is the notion of power itself and how power, or the ability to exercise influence, is configured within the international system. Now, power, as I said, is often synonymous with influence. Some would argue that power is the ability of one actor to get another actor to do something the second actor would not ordinarily do on its own. So you're changing the behavior of another actor through an act of influence of some sort. Now, there are a variety of resources that allow one to accumulate and exercise power. Uh, in realist theory, states, their gross domestic products or national income, their population, their various kinds of military indicators of military capability. These are all ways in which we can try to measure the power that states have. And then we see whether our measurements of power do a good job in explaining outcomes. So an important kind of outcome that we might want to explain in international politics is, why does the likelihood of war change over time? So there are periods, for instance, much of the 19th century, when great power war was uncommon. It wasn't absent entirely, but there were relatively few wars between the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century and World War I at the beginning of the 20th century. World War I was followed in fairly short order by World War II, and then you had another period of declining warfare. There were quite a few smaller wars, usually involving great powers intervening in smaller powers, but there were no great power wars. And even more recently, we've even seen quite a decline in the number of wars in general among weaker powers, or where great powers intervene in weaker countries. So we know that the likelihood or the incidence of war does change over time. So why is that? Well, we can't resort to look for changes in the type of actors, the motivation, structure of the system. We look for changes in the configuration of power in the international system. Now, the arguments I'm going to walk through in the rest of this lecture all go back to the concept of power in some way or another, and treat power as an independent variable. Let's look first at realist arguments about how states deal with threats to their security, which are, in fact, have to do with how do you tell there's a threat to your security? You look at the power of other states and their ability to use that, usually military power, to threaten your sovereignty. Well, how do countries respond when they perceive such threats? Well, there are several ways. One is called balancing, that states can try to, if they perceive a neighboring country is a threat, mostly because it has the capability to threaten you, or you may also pair that with an assessment that it has an intention to do so. You can try to balance against that the power of that country. You can try to make sure that the country doesn't gain significant enough advantage that they would be tempted to invade or try to intimidate you or force you to do something you don't want to do. Now, how do you balance? There are two mechanisms. One is internal, that you can spend more money on your military, try to build up the number of troops, weapons, improve the quality of your weapons, how you deploy your weapons, all in order to balance the military power of a threatening neighbor. That's internal balancing. External balancing, instead, is you try to line up an ally. So you find another country who feels similarly threatened by the third country, and you form an alliance to say, hey, if you're attacked, I'll come to your aid. If I'm attacked, you come to my aid. That's called an alliance. Now, notice that an alliance not only means that you get something out of it, that you get protection from the confidence that another country will come to your aid if you're attacked, which hopefully will discourage an attack in the first place, but also that you have to come to the other country's aid, or at least that's the promise you're making, whether you carry it out or not. And in doing so, you're that commitment means that you're taking risks. If you have to honor that commitment, then obviously that entails costs. Now, another way in which a country can respond to a security threat is to say, you know what, this country is threatening, but not just to me. And maybe I can get some other country to do the hard work of, balancing against and maybe absorbing the possible aggression of the country that worries me. So if you have, country A is considered threatening to both B and C, country B will say, hey, I'm going to try to pass the buck, meaning I'm going to try to force C to do the work of countering A, and try to redirect A's aggression to country C, so that I don't have to actually carry the costs of balancing. That's called buck passing. You're trying to pass the buck. It's like hot potato. You throw the hot potato to the next guy and force them to do the hard work. There's some disadvantages to that, which we'll come back to later. A third kind of response is called bandwagoning. It's the idea that, in an election campaign, you used to have in the old days these wagons that were pulled, and you'd have a candidate on the wagon, and there'd be a band on the wagon and playing songs and, waving, shouting. The candidate would wave, and there'd be banners and everything to try to win public support. And what you do is bandwagoning means that you wait to see which candidate seems likely to win. You jump on that candidate's bandwagon. So you want to be with the winner. You don't really care who wins. You just want to make sure whoever wins, you're on their side, and they see that you're on their side. And so, bandwagoning means basically you wait and find out who's the stronger power, and then you side with them. Well, this is a strategy of the week, basically, is that if you are too weak to balance against a threat yourself, you just don't have the resources, the population, the economy to be able to balance against the military forces of a neighbor. Or you don't really have viable alliances that could, any other countries that are willing to come to your aid. So alliances are not a possibility. You can't really realistically buck pass. There's nobody to pass the buck to. Well, if those are all the case, then you don't have any choice other than bandwagon, which means that you basically make yourself subservient to the country you feel threatened by. Instead of standing up to them and resisting them, you basically accommodate them. You become conciliatory. You give up some of your independence and basically do what accede to the demands of the stronger power. So those are the three options. Countries, when they feel threatened, they can balance, they can buck pass, and they can bandwagon. Usually, the stronger countries will balance, the weakest countries will bandwagon, and buck passing will depend upon whether, in fact, there's anyone to pass the buck to. All right. Now, another set of arguments about the role of power in world politics, and I'm trying to get the light to come on without success here, is to examine how many great powers there are in the international system. So realists distinguish between countries that have sufficient size, population, economic resources, technology to compete at the top of their class, that they are, for the given time period, among the biggest or strongest powers in the world. And usually there are no more than a handful of those, right? And then other countries are maybe medium level powers or small powers, but they're not. They don't have all of the ingredients to be a great power. But the number of great powers itself can vary, right? So one argument is that a static view of polarity, or a pole being a great power, um, is that the likelihood of war, of great power war, depends upon the number of great powers. So, for instance, you can have a multipolar world where there are at least three or more great powers. You can have a bipolar world where there are only two great powers. Or you can have a unipolar world, sometimes called a hegemonic world, hegemony meaning dominance. And in a unipolar world, there's only one great power. All the other countries are much weaker. All right? Now, the argument is that the more great powers, the more likely war is. That great powers systems are more unstable with more great powers than with fewer. So a multipolar system is the most unstable, especially a tripolar system. Now, a tripolar system, it's easy to see why. Countries are going to try to seek out allies because the likelihood is that you will have two against one. Assuming they're roughly equal great powers, then the country that's left out, that's isolated on its own, is going to be at an enormous disadvantage. So countries are going to struggle to line up allies, right? They're going to want to make sure they're on the side of the two, but and if they are, they have the possibility of ganging up together against the third country. So tripolar systems involve very intense competition and are very dangerous. But multipolar systems in general, in the early first half of the 20th century, we had essentially a multipolar system where there were a number of European great powers. The United States was a great power. Japan was a great power. Great Britain, Germany, Italy, France, Russia. So you had usually, half dozen great powers. And they were close enough to one another to be relative equals, even though they weren't entirely, there were differences, but they were all great powers. Now, the problem in a multipolar system is that if you are trying to figure out where to direct your military efforts, which country to worry about, you have maybe, if there are half dozen great powers, you have 5 other countries, each of whom could pose the greatest threat, and you're not sure which one actually does. So you have to divide your military attention, your intelligence networks, among monitoring 5 different great powers. And you may make a mistake. You may decide that, this country is my greatest threat, move your troops accordingly, build your alliances accordingly, but it turns out the threat actually is coming from another direction. So, also, if you think about it in a bipolar system, there's only one great power relationship that has to be managed, right? There's only 2 great powers, so each has one other great power to worry about. They know where the threat is likely to come from. They therefore know how to accordingly focus their resources, their intelligence. They're going to very, closely monitor that one other country. But also, if they want to avoid war, they know with whom they need to make some accommodation. But in the case of, if you have 6 countries or 5 countries, you have so many different relationships across which war could break out and so many different potential areas of conflict that could escalate to war. Moreover, the alliance, you really, in a bipolar system, you know that the only way to effectively balance is through building up your own military, because the smaller countries are too weak to really make a difference in the bipolar balance. It's really about keeping up with the other side, an arms race. Whereas in a multipolar system, if you have 5 other countries to worry about, well, several of them ganged up on you, then you're not going to be able to build your military big enough to handle 2 or 3, other great powers. Your only option is to find an alliances with sufficient number of other great powers that together you're able to stand up to any opposing alliance. So again, that introduces lots of uncertainties because you're making alliances based upon the hope and assumption that somebody else will come to your aid if you're attacked, but there's never any certainty. There's no guarantees that your alliance partner will uphold their commitments. They may prefer to buck pass, in other words, to force you to take the brunt of fighting the common enemy. So in those cases, for all those reasons, multipolar systems are very unstable. It's hard to find a stable balance that will ensure against war. In a bipolar system, on the other hand, both countries have a strong incentive to keep up with each other, to maintain a balance sufficient that no one has enough of an advantage that they can actually hope to win in war. And that's what we had between 1945 and 1991, a bipolar system. So some realists argue that pre-1945 is 2 world wars. That's a good example of why multipolar systems are most dangerous. What followed, the Cold War, while it did involve brush fire wars or great powers intervening in smaller countries like Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, there was no great power war, no World War III. Some argue that's because of bipolarity between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Now, eventually, however, the Soviet Union couldn't keep up and, in fact, split into 14 parts, dramatically declined economically, militarily, which left 2 minus 1 is 1. So for a time, starting in the early 1990s, the United States was a hegemonic power. Whether we still are a unipole or a hegemonic power is up for debate. More and more people are arguing that China has risen far enough, fast enough to constitute a viable pole in itself, a great power that is, if not already on a par with the U.S., is quickly moving in that direction. In that case, we may be moving from a unipolar to a bipolar system. But notice that during the period from 91 to the present, it's been a relatively peaceful period. We're going to look at some data later in a future lecture that establishes that point. So here's one argument, right? Here's one hypothesis that the number of great powers affects the likelihood of war. The more great powers, the more likely war. The fewer great powers, the less likely war. Now, there's another way of looking at the distribution of power, and that's to take a dynamic view. Polarity just looks at, let's take a snapshot at a point in time and see how the distribution of power affects the likelihood of war. But what if we put that in motion, like a motion picture, and we looked at changes and trend lines? Well, here we get a different kind of argument. So another realist theory is that what leads to war, the likelihood of war rises at that moment where the established dominant power is being surpassed by a rising challenger. So, ironically, it's when the distance, the gap between the top country and the next largest country or most powerful country, when that gap is greatest, when power is most unequal, then the likelihood of great power war is at its lowest. Now, this is obvious in some ways. It's, if there's only one great power, then there's no other great power to have a war with, right? But moreover, what small country would start a war with the one big great power? Moreover, the big great power doesn't need to go to war to get smaller countries to do what it wants, right? It can just threaten. So war should be pretty infrequent in that case. That's the unipolar system that we talked about earlier. But let's set this in motion. Let's assume that there's some mechanism that ensures that hegemons or unipoles never don't last forever. Well, in that case, you'll eventually have a challenger. And if that challenger is rising, then there are two possibilities. One is as it approaches the previous dominant country, that country feels threatened. And in that case, the hegemon will want to start a preemptive war, right? They want to fight the war before the challenger is strong enough to win, right? While they still have an advantage. If they wait 10 years, the challenger will be, because its economy is growing faster or its population is growing faster, it will be so strong that the hegemon will no longer be able to be assured of victory in war. So what you do is you start a preemptive war before the challenger overtakes you. That makes some sense. Others argue that war is more likely once the challenger has gained an advantage and therefore will try to overturn the rules and norms of the existing order by using its advantage to defeat the hegemon. The first argument makes better sense, though, because why would a hegemon allow itself to be overtaken? There have been some studies of this phenomenon. One scholar, Graham Allison, claims to have looked at 16 different cases where a great power is being overtaken by a rising challenger, and argues that in 12 of those cases, that dynamic led to great power war. It's called power transition theory. Others have challenged the interpretation that Allison and others have placed on this and are more skeptical. In the current situation, the question would be whether China's rise will lead to a power transition dynamic that raises the risks of war. Now, another way to think about the risks of war has to do with the impact that the balance between offense and defense affects the likelihood of war. Now, we're not talking about the balance between one country and other countries. We're talking about whether it's easier to take territory through military action than it is to hold territory. So the offense is not, we don't mean the offense is necessarily an aggressor in war. We're not, that aggressor and victim are basically, moral interpretations about responsibility. What we're getting at here isn't about that. It's about whether a military is trying to take territory or whether it's trying to hold territory. And if it's trying to take territory, it's on the offense. If it's trying to hold territory, it's on the defense. Now, let's say that, let's look at what happened in 1991 with the Persian Gulf War. Actually, the prior year, Iraqi troops invaded Kuwait, right? So they were on the offense. They were taking territory successfully. And then once they had conquered Kuwait, then they assumed a defensive position along the border with Saudi Arabia. The United States and its allies decided to try to reverse that aggression, and therefore, in some sense, they were the defender. They were trying to defend Kuwait's sovereignty. But the next phase of the war was such that Iraqi troops, having already taken positions in Kuwait, were on the defense, trying to hold territory, and the American and Allied troops took the offense to try to take territory to push the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. So then they were on the offense. So the same army can be on the offense in one phase of a war and on the defense in a different phase. Depends on what they're trying to accomplish. Nevertheless, the first phase of a war necessarily involves offense. Somebody has to make the first move and try to take territory. And that places them on the offense. And that also usually means that we might refer to them as an aggressor as well. Now, it turns out that we can ask ourselves, what is the balance between offense and defense? What we mean by that is it easier to take territory or to hold it? If it's easier to take territory, then we can say that the offense has the advantage over the defense. If it's easier to hold territory, the defense has the advantage. Now, what does it mean to say advantage? Well, it means that in order for the offense to have an advantage, it means that that the defense would have to have more troops and more weapons to successfully hold than the offense. That if it's a straight up, even battle, same number of troops and weapons, the offense wins. If we say the defense has an advantage, it means that if it's a straight up even contest in numbers, then the defense wins. It would require, the offense would need more troops and more weapons in order to defeat an entrenched defense. And in fact, that's usually the case. In fact, if you have there's a rule of thumb which basically says that the offense usually finds it harder to take territory than the defense is to hold it. It might usually often take 3 times as many soldiers or weapons in order for the offense to dislodge the defense. Now, the reason for this is pretty simple. It's that the defender is able to hunker down behind obstacles like forts and trenches and waterways, or in the old days moats, and then the offense, on the other hand, has to move. They have to be mobile, and in order to approach a well-defended fortification, they have to expose themselves and thereby place themselves at greater risk. So it's hard to overcome an entrenched defense. Now, that's a good thing, because that means that usually, not always, it depends on terrain, usually the defender has an advantage, which means offense is difficult. If offense were easy all the time, then the aggressor would always have an initial advantage, and war would happen much more frequently. So in a world where the defense usually has the advantage, then war is discouraged. In a world where the offense usually has the advantage, then war is much more common. Another way of saying this is that we talked about the security dilemma, where, arming for even for defense threatens others. Well, if arming especially threatens others in an offense-dominant world, and so countries are forced into intense security dilemmas if the offense has the advantage. Moreover, if the offense has the advantage, you're going to want to find allies, right? Your defense is not going to, on its own, be enough to to protect you. You're going to need to find another country willing to come to your aid quickly, so that you can build up the numbers to resist what otherwise would be a very effective offense. Now, what determines whether, and on the other side, by the way, if the defense is dominant, if it's very hard to carry out to take territory, then the security dilemma weakens. Countries don't have to feel so threatened. Security is stronger, and countries can buck pass because they can basically feel that their own defense is strong enough, and they can try to force others to carry the burden against a potential aggressor. Now, what determines whether the offense or defense has an advantage? There are lots of things. There's technology is one. For instance, in the early phases of World War I, it was thought that the war would be a quick offensive war, because the offense had the advantage in the previous great power war, which was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So it was thought that, like the Prussian army in 1870, that whoever struck first would be able to overwhelm a defense and win quickly. So it was expected it would be a short war. But in fact, what happened is that the war bogged down quickly into trench warfare, where armies dug trenches and huddled down in their trenches and surrounded them with barbed wire and other kinds of obstacles, minefields and that sort of thing. And the reason is that it turned out to be, and it was almost impossible for the offense to gain territory. In the early phases of the war, troops would jump out of their trenches and charge toward the enemy lines, and they would just get mowed down. The reason is that by World War I, the machine gun had made a big difference. It was easy to fill the air with lead, so that anything above ground would be killed almost instantly, because you could fire so many bullets, as opposed to the old days where you had single shot weapons that had to be reloaded, and which took a lot of time. So while the enemy was reloading, you could make progress toward the enemy lines and potentially overtake them. So the machine gun gave an enormous advantage to the defense. Now, how did the war eventually end? Well, it became possible to take territory only once the tank was brought into warfare. Tank's basically a big metal box placed on some kind of wheels, and you put some kind of weapon on it that can shoot, and you just roll it toward the enemy lines. You can hit it as much as you want with bullets, but it's not going to stop it. And then the infantry would follow behind the tanks, and the tanks would just tear up the enemy lines and just roll right through the trenches and create gaps into which the offense could move its troops. So technology can shift whether the offense or defense has an advantage. Terrain can too. So in the Vietnam War, the enemy, the communist side, they found shelter in the jungles where the Americans had made it was very difficult to find them. And in fact, 70% of the battles in that war were initiated by the communists, because we could so rarely actually find the enemy and attack ourselves, because they were hidden under the jungle. We finally resorted to using napalm and defoliants, which basically burned up the jungle, so we could then have a totally exposed landscape to be able to see the enemy. But there were also mountains. Afghanistan, mountainous, easy to hide, hard for the offense to overcome the defenders. On the other side, in the case of the Persian Gulf War in 1991, the Iraqi troops were exposed because it was just flat, featureless desert. Even though they tried to put their tanks in the ground, they could easily be found through thermo imaging technologies. And so there was nothing to hide behind. And therefore, the American forces were able quite easily to take ground and chew up the enemy forces. So terrain that is very rugged and allows for lots of obstacles to the offense gives a defensive advantage. I'm going to stop here, and we'll finish up our discussion of realism in the next lecture. Thanks.